The story of the third atomic bomb is one that has been largely overshadowed by the iconic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet it represents one of the most crucial moments in 20th century history, a moment when the trajectory of warfare, diplomacy, and the entire post-war world hung in a precarious balance. This is the tale of a weapon that was ready, a target that was chosen, and a decision that changed everything. It is the story of how close humanity came to witnessing an entirely different outcome in the final days of World War II. When the second atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, most people around the world assumed that America had exhausted its nuclear arsenal. The two mushroom clouds rising over Japan seemed to represent the complete extent of the Manhattan Project's deadly harvest, the sum total of years of scientific endeavor, billions of dollars in investment, and the concentrated effort of over 130,000 workers across the United States. This assumption was profoundly incorrect. Even as the nuclear fires consumed Nagasaki, even as Japanese officials debated their nation's fate behind the walls of their war rooms, scientists and technicians at Los Alamos in New Mexico were already preparing the core for a third atomic weapon. And President Harry Truman, along with his military commanders, was actively considering exactly where this next bomb should fall. The Manhattan Project had not simply produced two bombs and then ceased operations. The vast industrial complex that had been constructed across America, a secret city spanning multiple states and employing over 130,000 workers, continued operating at full capacity even as the atomic bombs fell on Japan. This unprecedented industrial undertaking represented one of the largest scientific projects ever conceived. From the uranium enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where massive electromagnetic and gaseous diffusion plants separated uranium isotopes under conditions of extreme secrecy, to the plutonium production reactors at Hanford, Washington, where the first reactor, designated B reactor, had gone critical in September 1944, the entire complex hummed with activity. The bomb assembly laboratories at Los Alamos, New Mexico, in a remote mesa facility hidden from the world, continued their meticulous work. General Leslie Groves, the military commander who oversaw the entire Manhattan Project with an iron will, had established a production schedule that seemed almost surreal in its ambition. This schedule would deliver atomic bomb cores at a steady, accelerating rate. The third plutonium core was scheduled to be ready by August 19, 1945, just 10 days after the Nagasaki bombing. Additional cores would follow at intervals of approximately 3 to 4 days through August and into September, with the rate of production accelerating as the industrial processes became more refined and efficient. By the calculations of military planners in late July, the United States could have 2 to 3 atomic bombs ready per week by September, and as many as 7 or more by December. This was not speculation or theoretical discussion. This was the actual production schedule being executed by the Manhattan Project's vast infrastructure. The third bomb was not merely theoretical or planned for some distant future date. It was real material and rapidly approaching completion. The plutonium core fashioned from the exotic element produced in the Hanford reactors through a process of extreme complexity was being shaped and machined at Los Alamos with precision. The conventional high-explosive lenses 32 precisely shaped charges made of composition B and barytol that would compress this core to achieve critical mass were being manufactured and tested. The ballistic casing known as Fat Man, named after the rotund shape required to house the implosion mechanism, was being assembled and prepared for shipment. Everything was proceeding according to schedule. Military planners were not simply discussing the third bomb as an abstract possibility. They were actively making plans for a sustained atomic bombing campaign that could extend through the fall of 1945 and into 1946 if Japan did not surrender. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had received authorization on July 25th to continue atomic bombing operations without explicit presidential approval for each subsequent strike. The order stated clearly that additional bombs would be delivered on targets as soon as they were made ready. The question of where Truman wanted to drop this third bomb requires understanding the strategic thinking in Washington during those tense August days following the Potsdam Conference. The original target list for atomic weapons had been compiled through an exhaustive process involving military strategists, scientists, and intelligence analysts. The Target Committee had met multiple times in the spring of 1945 to select cities that met specific criteria for maximum strategic and psychological impact. These targets needed to be important enough that their destruction would demonstrate the bomb's power and convince Japanese leaders that continued resistance was futile. They needed to be relatively undamaged by previous conventional bombing raids so that the atomic bomb's unique destructive power would be unmistakable to the Japanese leadership and the world. They needed to have military or industrial significance, though this distinction became grotesquely blurred in practice when cities with mixed civilian and military populations were selected. The original list included Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagata, and Nagasaki. One city conspicuously absent from the actual bombing list was Kyoto, the ancient capital and cultural heart of Japan. Initially included because of its size and industrial capacity, Kyoto had been removed by personal intervention of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who argued that destroying such a culturally significant city, one laden with centuries of Buddhist temples and imperial palaces, would create lasting enmity and make post-war reconciliation impossible. This single act of restraint by one government official may have had enormous consequences for the post-war relationship between Japan and America. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struck, two cities from the original list remained as potential targets: Kokura and Nagata. Additionally, military planners had identified several other potential targets, including Tokyo, which, despite extensive firebombing that had killed over 100,000 Chis in a single night on March 9-10, 1945, still contained important military and governmental facilities. The industrial cities of Yokohama, Osaka, and Kobe were also under consideration. The evidence available to historians suggests that Tokyo itself was emerging as the preferred target for the third atomic bomb. This would have represented a dramatic escalation, as Tokyo was not just another city, but the political and symbolic heart of the Japanese Empire. The imperial palace where Emperor Hirohito resided stood in central Tokyo. The government ministries that directed the war effort were concentrated there. Destroying Tokyo with an atomic weapon would have sent an unmistakable message that no part of Japan was safe, that even the sacred person of the emperor could not be protected from this new form of warfare. On August 10, 1945, just one day after the Nagasaki bombing, General Leslie Groves sent a remarkable memorandum to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. The memorandum stated that a third bomb of the implosion type would be ready to ship on August 12th or 13th, even earlier than the original date of August 24th. The bomb would be ready to use, Groves wrote, in the first suitable weather after 17 or 18 August. This was extraordinary information. Groves was informing the highest military command that they could have another atomic bomb ready to use within days, not weeks. Upon reading the memo, General Marshall made a handwritten notation on August 10th. It is not to be released over Japan without express authority from the President. G. Marshall. Groves recognizing the significance of the moment and the moral weight of what was about to happen, recommended that Marshall authorize him to delay the shipment of the third bomb to give the Japanese government time to surrender. A delay until noon on August 13th was orally agreed upon between the two men, according to Groves's records. This was a critical decision, a few hours that might change everything. But the afternoon of August 13th arrived with no word from Japan. Groves attempted to get in touch with both Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General Marshall, but could reach neither. He spoke with Deputy Chief of Staff General Thomas Handy, and neither man felt he had the authority to further delay the shipment of fissionable material. Groves, in an extraordinary act of individual conscience and judgment, decided on his own authority that he would exceed his instructions. He informed General Handy that in the absence of any word from Marshall, he would not ship any fissionable material for the third bomb until he could see Marshall in person. This decision by General Groves' one military commander, essentially putting a hold on the atomic bomb production line without explicit authorization, was a pivotal moment. He was using his judgment to buy time for Japan to surrender, to give the machinery of their government a few more hours to make the critical decision. What Groves did not know, but what we now understand from historical documents, was that the Japanese government was in a state of paralysis during these exact hours. Even after Hiroshima, even after Nagasaki, even after the Soviet Union's invasion of Manchuria on August 9th, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War remained deadlocked. The peace faction, led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, argued for accepting the Potsdam Declaration's terms for unconditional surrender with the sole condition that the imperial system be preserved. They understood that continued resistance was futile, that the war was lost, and that every day of continued fighting meant more death and suffering for the Japanese people. The military faction, led by War Minister Kochika Anami and the chiefs of the Army and Navy General Staffs, refused to accept defeat. They insisted on multiple conditions, including that no occupation forces would occupy Japan proper, that the Japanese would handle their own war criminals, and that Japan would disarm itself rather than accepting Allied control. This rigid stance, rooted in Japanese military honor and the samurai code, was leading Japan toward absolute annihilation. This deadlock meant that even as Japanese cities burned and the atomic bombs fell, even as Soviet armies swept through Manchuria, crushing the Kwantung Army, the government could not act. The machinery of Japanese decision-making had ground to a halt, trapped between two incompatible visions of surrender. Emperor Hirohito's role became absolutely decisive precisely because of this political deadlock. In an unprecedented intervention on August 10th, and then more forcefully on August 14th, following an attempted military coup by officers opposed to surrender, the emperor broke with tradition and actively directed his government to accept the Allied terms. This sacred decision, as it came to be known, was technically an imperial order that bypassed the usual requirement for unanimous consensus in the Big Six Council. In Japanese culture and law, the emperor's voice was final and decisive. Disobeying it was tantamount to treason. War Minister Anami and the other militarists, though deeply unhappy and humiliated, submitted to the emperor's authority. Without this intervention, the atomic bombing campaign would have continued. The third bomb would have fallen. The morning of August 15th brought one final crisis that almost prevented the surrender announcement. A group of intransigent military officers, furious at what they saw as a betrayal of Japan, attempted a coup d'etat. Young officers and soldiers, armed and desperate, moved through Tokyo trying to prevent the emperor's recorded radio address, the dual voice recording, or Gyokuwan Hoso, from being broadcast to the Japanese people. The coup plotters stormed the imperial palace, searching for the phonograph records containing the emperor's voice. They occupied key military installations in Tokyo. The sound of bombardment was audible from the palace bunker as soldiers loyal to the government fought to suppress the rebellion. In the confusion, the coup plotters managed to destroy copies of the recording, and there was a genuine moment when it seemed the announcement might not be made. But the coup was ultimately contained. Its leaders died by suicide in the imperial palace. The rebellion, dramatic as it was, could not overturn the emperor's decision. The phonograph records, the ones that survived or had been hidden, made their way to the headquarters of Japan Broadcast Corporation. Radio announcers across the nation spent the morning of August 15th preparing people for an important broadcast at noon, instructing them to listen honestly and solemnly without fail. At noon on August 15, 1945, in a voice that most Japanese had never heard before, Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender. The war was over. The third bomb's plutonium core did arrive at Tinian Island in the Mariana Islands, where the 509th Composite Group waited with their specially modified B-29 bombers and their crews of brave men. But by then, Japan had agreed to surrender. The war had ended. The machinery of atomic warfare had been stopped, not by policy or principle, but by the slim margin of a few hours and the courage of an emperor. This core, rather than being dropped on a Japanese city, whether Tokyo, Kokura, or any of the other cities on the target list, ended up serving a different purpose. It became the heart of a fourth nuclear weapon. This weapon was never used in war, but was instead detonated as part of a scientific test. In July 1946, at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, the third bomb's core was detonated as the Baker shot in Operation Crossroads, one of the first atomic tests conducted after the war ended, as American military and scientific leaders sought to understand the full effects of their creation. The implications of what nearly happened with the third bomb extend far beyond the immediate question of how Japan would have responded to additional atomic strikes. If Tokyo had been destroyed by an atomic bomb, killing potentially hundreds of thousands more people, including possibly Emperor Hirohito himself, the entire post-war order in Asia might have developed differently. The occupation of Japan, which became one of the most successful military occupations and nation-building efforts in history, relied heavily on preserving the imperial system and working through the emperor to legitimize reforms and ensure Japanese compliance. The MacArthur occupation, which transformed Japan from a militaristic empire into a democratic nation, depended fundamentally on the existence of a functioning imperial government and the prestige of the emperor. Without that stabilizing institution, Japan's reconstruction could have been far more chaotic and contentious. The demonstration of American willingness to destroy even the most sacred symbols of Japanese culture. The imperial palace itself might have created deeper and more lasting enmity, making the eventual alliance between America and Japan more difficult to achieve. Instead of the strong US-Japan partnership that has lasted for over 70 years, we might have witnessed a much more antagonistic relationship, with Soviet forces potentially occupying more of Japan and the entire post-war settlement in Asia taking a radically different form. The production schedule for additional atomic bombs in August and September 1945 reveals the extent to which atomic warfare was becoming systematized and routine rather than special and exceptional. By late August, Los Alamos expected to deliver cores at a rate that would have supported 2 to 3 atomic bombing missions per week by September. The 509th Composite Group had multiple aircraft and crews trained for atomic missions. The infrastructure for transporting, assembling, and delivering atomic weapons was functioning efficiently. Had the war continued, atomic bombing would have simply become another tool in the American arsenal, used alongside conventional bombing, naval bombardment, and preparation for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The uniqueness of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as singular war-ending events was not inevitable, but rather the consequence of Japan's surrender, preventing what might have become a sustained atomic bombing campaign. The scientists who built the atomic bomb held varied views about its use. Some, like Leo Szilard and James Franck, had advocated for a demonstration of the bomb's power rather than its use against cities, hoping that shocking Japan with a display of this new weapon would be sufficient without mass civilian casualties. The Franck Report, issued in June 1945 by scientists at the University of Chicago's Metallurgical Laboratory, called for an international demonstration of the bomb's power to convince the Japanese to surrender. Leo Szilard, the Hungarian-American physicist who had originally proposed using nuclear fission as a weapon, and who had urged President Roosevelt to begin the atomic bomb program before Nazi Germany could develop one, now worked to draft a petition opposing the bomb's use. Despite his expressed desire to develop atomic weapons before Germany, Szilard publicly stated his opposition to using the bomb in war. His petition, signed by Manhattan Project scientists and technicians, argued that atomic attacks on Japan could not be justified, at least not until the terms which will be imposed upon Japan have been made public in detail and Japan were given an opportunity to surrender. Others, including Robert Oppenheimer and the majority of scientists working on the project, supported using the bomb against military and industrial targets, though many later expressed profound ambivalence about the weapons they had created. The physicist Robert Oppenheimer, who directed the Los Alamos laboratory, had reportedly told his colleagues after the Trinity test, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." After the war, Oppenheimer became an advocate for nuclear peace and opposed the construction of the even more powerful hydrogen bomb. When he met with President Truman after the war to discuss international control of nuclear weapons, he told the president, "I feel I have blood on my hands." The weight of what he had created never left him. Still others, like Edward Teller, showed little hesitation about the bomb's use and actively promoted development of even more powerful nuclear weapons. The Hungarian-American physicist Teller would go on to become the driving force behind the development of the hydrogen bomb and the expansion of the American nuclear arsenal during the Cold War. These disagreements among the scientists continued throughout the Cold War, with some Manhattan Project veterans becoming advocates for arms control and nuclear disarmament, while others became supporters of expanded nuclear arsenals and strategic doctrine based on nuclear deterrence. President Harry Truman, thrust into the presidency after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945 and faced with the terrible knowledge of atomic weapons, wrestled with the moral implications of what he was being asked to do. He had been told that an invasion of Japan's home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, would result in massive casualties. Military planners estimated that the invasion would cost between 100,000 and 500,000 American lives, with some estimates reaching as high as 1 million. Japanese casualties, including military and civilians mobilized to defend the homeland, were estimated at between 5 and 10 million. These were not abstract numbers to Truman. They represented the sons of American mothers, the brothers and husbands of American women. They represented the lives that would be lost if American forces had to fight their way across the Japanese home islands against a population mobilized for total war and told by their military leaders to fight to the death rather than surrender. Yet Truman was also a man of conscience. After learning details about the devastation of Hiroshima, he reportedly told his cabinet that he did not want to kill all those children. He was receiving messages from religious leaders and concerned citizens urging him to stop the bombing. The conflict between military necessity and moral conscience was a torment that haunted him. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, both conventional and atomic, represents one of the most troubling chapters of American military history. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed more people in a single night, over 100,000 in some estimates, than the atomic bomb would kill at Hiroshima. Dozens of other Japanese cities were systematically destroyed by incendiary raids specifically designed to maximize civilian casualties and break Japanese morale through fear and devastation. The atomic bombs were different, not in their targeting of civilian populations, which conventional bombing had already made routine, but in their efficiency, their shock value, and their demonstration that a single aircraft carrying a single bomb could destroy an entire city. The psychological impact was enormous. The realization that the entire war production could be wiped out not by fleets of thousands of aircraft, but by a single plane carrying a single weapon. The third bomb would have continued this pattern, and the fourth, fifth, and sixth bombs that were in various stages of production would have followed. Within weeks, atomic warfare would have become routine. Within months, cities across Japan would have been destroyed not by millions of conventional bombs dropped from thousands of aircraft, but by hundreds of atomic weapons delivered by a handful of specially trained crews. Historians have long debated whether the atomic bombs were necessary to achieve Japanese surrender. Some argue that the bombs were unnecessary, that Japan was already defeated and would have surrendered within weeks or months due to the naval blockade strangling its economy and the Soviet entry into the war, demolishing Japanese armies in Manchuria. They point to intelligence that suggested the Japanese government was seeking surrender terms even before the bombs fell. Others maintain that the bombs were essential to achieving surrender without a catastrophically costly invasion, pointing to the military faction's continued resistance even after 2 atomic bombs had fallen and Soviet forces had invaded Manchuria. They argue that the Japanese military leadership was prepared to fight to the death, to sacrifice millions of Japanese lives rather than accept the shame of surrender, and that only the shock of atomic weapons combined with the Emperor's personal intervention could break this deadlock. The truth likely lies somewhere between these positions, complicated by the fact that we cannot rerun history to see what would have happened under different scenarios. We cannot know with certainty whether Japan would have surrendered a day later, a week later, or if the war would have continued into September and beyond. What we can say with certainty is that American leaders in August 1945 believed they needed to continue applying maximum pressure, including atomic bombing, to force Japan's surrender before the scheduled November invasion of Kyushu. What is undeniable is that the third atomic bomb was ready. The machinery of atomic warfare had been set in motion with such force and momentum that stopping it required active intervention rather than passive delay. General Groves's decision to not ship the fissionable material, General Marshall's restraint and good judgment, and most critically, Emperor Hirohito's decision to break with tradition and personally order the acceptance of surrender. These were the factors that prevented the third bomb from falling. Had any one of these factors been different, had General Groves not delayed the shipment, had Hirohito not intervened when he did, had the Japanese military coup succeeded in preventing the surrender announcement, then on August 19th or 20th, 1945, a third atomic bomb would have descended on a Japanese city. The historical consequences would have rippled through the remainder of the 20th century and beyond, creating a different post-war world than the one we inhabit. The third bomb that never fell remains one of history's most significant might-have-beens. It represents the narrowness of the margin by which catastrophe was prevented, the precariousness of the moment when atomic weapons entered human history, and the critical importance of individual decisions made in moments of enormous pressure and uncertainty. The apparatus existed to continue atomic bombing indefinitely. The will to use these weapons repeatedly until Japan surrendered was present in the military and political leadership. Only the surrender announcement on August 15th prevented the third bomb and the fourth, fifth, and sixth from falling on Japanese cities during the final weeks of summer in 1945. This is the story of how close we came and how history turned on decisions made in just a few hours.